The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled my room as I scrolled through my phone, trying to distract myself from the pain. 3 weeks after giving birth to my beautiful daughter Emma, I was still recovering from severe complications that had kept me in the hospital far longer than expected. That's when I received the email that would shatter my entire world. Not from my father's law firm as I'd expected, but from my mother-in-law, Eleanor Mitchell's personal attorney. Before we dive deeper into this story that changed my life forever, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to know how a simple DNA test turned my mother-in-law's perfect plan into her worst nightmare. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. I hadn't always had a strained relationship with Eleanor. When I first married her son Marcus, she'd welcomed me into the Mitchell family with what I thought was open arms. Sure, she could be controlling and had strong opinions about everything from how I dressed to how I should quit my job as a pediatric nurse. But I'd tried to see the best in her. Even when she'd made snide comments about my father Robert Anderson's success in business, suggesting that old money like the Mitchells was somehow more prestigious than self-made wealth, I'd smiled and let it slide. The familiar ache in my chest returned as I thought about my father. He'd passed away unexpectedly just 2 months before my daughter's birth, leaving behind not just an emotional void but also his highly successful tech consulting firm and substantial estate. I'd been named his sole heir, something that had clearly bothered Eleanor more than she'd let on at the funeral, where she'd maintained a perfect mask of sympathetic grace. As I opened the email, my hands trembling slightly from post-surgery weakness, I expected to see the final inheritance paperwork I'd been waiting for. Instead, what filled my screen made my heart stop. It was a legal document claiming that my father had signed over his entire estate to Eleanor Mitchell just 3 days before his death, complete with what appeared to be his signature. The room started spinning, and I had to grab onto the bed rail to steady myself. This couldn't be real. My father would never have done this. He'd spent years building his company from nothing, and we'd talked extensively about his plans for its future. He'd wanted me to take over when I was ready, to continue his legacy while pursuing my own dreams in healthcare innovation. Mrs. Mitchell. A nurse's voice pulled me from my shock. My colleague and best friend Olivia Chen stood in the doorway, concern etched across her face. Your vitals just spiked on the monitor. Is everything okay? I couldn't speak, just handed her my phone with trembling hands. As she read, her professional composure slipped, replaced by a mix of disbelief and anger. Rachel, this is impossible. Your father would never. I know, I whispered, my voice stronger than I felt. Eleanor must have. But how? The signature looks so real. A soft knock interrupted us, and as if summoned by our conversation, Eleanor Mitchell swept into the room in her designer suit, perfectly coiffed silver hair framing a face that radiated false concern. Rachel, darling, I just came to check on you and my precious granddaughter. Have you received the email from Mr. Phillips? I wanted to tell you myself, but he insisted on handling it professionally. The way she said precious granddaughter sent chills down my spine. Something in her tone, a hint of triumph perhaps, made me wonder if there was more to this than just the inheritance. I'd noticed how she'd been unusually interested in Emma's features since her birth, making odd comments about how she didn't look like her side of the family. Eleanor, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. There must be some mistake. Dad would never have signed over everything to you. We had detailed discussions about the company's future. She perched elegantly on the visitor's chair, smoothing her skirt with manicured hands. Oh dear, I know this must be quite a shock, but Robert and I had grown quite close in those final weeks. He understood the importance of having someone with proper business experience manage his legacy, someone with the right connections. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. We wouldn't want his life's work squandered by someone whose priorities might be divided between running a company and changing diapers, would we? The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Olivia, still standing by my bed, stepped forward protectively. "Mrs. Mitchell, Rachel needs rest. Perhaps this discussion should wait until she's released." Eleanor stood, adjusting her designer handbag with practiced grace. "Of course, dear. Rest well, Rachel. Don't worry about a thing. I'll make sure everything is handled properly." She paused at the door, turning back with what seemed like genuine emotion. "You know, Emma really is a beautiful baby. She reminds me so much of Marcus when he was born. It's fascinating how genetics work, isn't it?" After she left, Olivia grabbed my hand. "Rachel, something's not right here. The timing, the signature, the way she's acting about Emma. We need to talk to James Harrison." James had been my father's personal attorney for 20 years. I nodded, already reaching for my phone. But as I dialed his number, Eleanor's last words kept echoing in my mind. There was something about the way she'd emphasized genetics, something that nagged at the edges of my consciousness. "Olivia," I said slowly, a new thought forming. "Remember last month when they ran all those extra tests on Emma because of her blood type? The ones Eleanor was so interested in?" Olivia's eyes widened as she caught my meaning. "You don't think—" "I think," I said, my nurse's training kicking in as pieces started falling into place, "that we need more than just a lawyer. We need a DNA test. And we need to find out exactly where my father was in those final days before he died." My heart pounded as James's number rang. Whatever game Eleanor was playing, she'd chosen the wrong moment to strike. She thought that because I was stuck in this hospital bed, weakened from a difficult childbirth, that I would be easy prey. She had no idea what I was capable of, especially when it came to protecting my father's legacy and my daughter's future. If you think this story is intense already, just wait until you hear what the DNA test revealed. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell because tomorrow's part of this story will show you exactly how karma came for Eleanor Mitchell in the most unexpected way possible. As I waited for James to answer, I could feel my inner strength building. Eleanor Mitchell was about to learn a very important lesson. Never underestimate a mother protecting her child, especially one who has nothing left to lose. Voice came through my phone speaker with the same steady confidence I remembered from countless meetings in my father's office. "Rachel, I was just about to call you. I've received some concerning documents from Eleanor Mitchell's attorney. James, she's claiming Dad signed over everything to her just before he died. That's impossible. He was in Vancouver that week for the medical technology conference. We video chatted every evening about the new pediatric wing he wanted to fund." There was a long pause on the line. "Rachel, according to these papers, your father never went to Vancouver. Eleanor has provided documentation showing he was here in Seattle, meeting with her and her team of financial advisors." My mind raced back to those final video calls. The hotel room background, Dad's excitement about the conference speakers, his detailed notes about medical innovations that could help my pediatric patients. Had it all been staged? No, something wasn't adding up. Olivia, still standing guard by my hospital bed, suddenly snapped her fingers. "Rachel, the conference photos. Your father was tagged in them on LinkedIn. I remember because he was standing next to Dr. Santos. I showed my students his presentation on breakthrough pediatric treatments." My hands shook as I pulled up. LinkedIn on my phone. But when I searched for the photos, they were gone. All posts mentioning my father at the conference had vanished. Eleanor had been thorough. I had to give her that. "James," I said, my voice stronger now, "I need you to do two things. First, contact the conference organizers in Vancouver. Dad was a keynote speaker. There must be records, videos, something. Second, I need you to quietly look into any changes in his business dealings during those final days." "Already on it," James replied. "But Rachel, there's something else you should know. These documents, they don't just transfer the business and assets. There's a clause about Emma." My heart stopped. "What about Emma?" "Eleanor has filed For partial guardianship, claiming concerns about your fitness as a mother due to your extended hospitalization. She's using your medical complications as leverage. The monitors beside my bed began beeping faster as my pulse raced. Olivia immediately checked my vitals, her face tight with concern, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was Eleanor's earlier words about genetics and her obsession with Emma's features. James, how quickly can we get a DNA test done? DNA? Rachel, what are you thinking? Just a hunch, but I need to know if... I stopped as my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Marcus, my first message from him in days. Mom says you're being difficult about the inheritance. Just sign the papers, Rachel. It's what's best for everyone. Best for everyone? My own husband wasn't even questioning this insanity? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then again, he'd been surprisingly absent during my hospitalization, always making excuses about work meetings. Work meetings at his mother's company, I realized with growing suspicion. James, one more thing. I need you to look into Marcus's involvement in all this, and I need a different kind of DNA test, one that can tell us about paternity. Olivia gasped softly beside me, catching on. The blood type inconsistency. Before we could discuss further, my hospital room door opened again. This time it was Dr. Benjamin Wright, my colleague from the pediatric ward. His face was ashen. Rachel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see. It's about your father's last visit to the hospital. I put James on speaker as Ben pulled up records on his tablet. 2 days before your father's death, he was admitted for what appeared to be minor symptoms: dizziness, confusion. The attending physician was Dr. Victor Sterling. Eleanor's brother, I whispered, the pieces starting to fall into place. The symptoms were attributed to stress and travel fatigue. He was released after a few hours. But I just found something strange in the labs. There were certain markers in his blood work. Rachel, these look like the same patterns we see in cases of targeted poisoning. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of my heart monitor. James's voice cracked through the speaker. Dr. Wright, can you document everything you found? And Rachel, don't say a word to anyone about this. If what we're suspecting is true. It's more than inheritance fraud, I finished. This is something much bigger. Just then, my phone lit up with another text, this time from an unknown number. Your father tried to warn you. Check his vintage camera collection. Not everything is as it seems. I remembered Dad's prized cameras, his hobby since before I was born. The collection now sat in Eleanor's possession, along with everything else. What had he hidden there? What had he known? James, I said, my mind racing. How quickly can you get a court order to prevent Eleanor from removing any items from my father's house? Especially his cameras. I'll have it within the hour. And Rachel, be careful if Eleanor suspects you're investigating. Oh, she suspects, I said, thinking of her calculated visit earlier. But she doesn't know what we've found, and she doesn't know about the DNA test yet. After ending the call, I turned to Olivia and Ben. I need your help. Both of you. This isn't just about the inheritance anymore. I think my father was murdered. My husband may not be Emma's father, and Eleanor. Eleanor orchestrated all of it. But we need proof. Ben nodded grimly. I'll review all of your father's medical records, cross-reference them with cases involving similar toxicology patterns. If Dr. Sterling falsified anything, there will be traces. Olivia squeezed my hand. I'll contact the nurses who were on duty that night. Someone must have seen something. As they left to begin their investigations, I cradled my sleeping daughter, studying her tiny features. All those comments Eleanor had made about genetics, about Emma not looking like the Mitchell side. Had she known all along? Had this entire scheme been about more than just money? The answer, I suspected, lay in those vintage cameras. Whatever my father had discovered in his final days, whatever had led to his suspicious death, he'd left evidence. Eleanor may have thought she'd covered every trace, but she'd underestimated both my father's foresight and my determination to uncover the truth. I reached for my phone one last time, sending a text to Marcus. "You're right. I'll sign the papers. But first, I want to look through Dad's camera collection one last time, for memories." The response came quickly. "Mom says that's fine. Come by tomorrow." I smiled grimly at his predictability. Eleanor would be expecting a broken woman, weakened by childbirth and grief, coming to admit defeat. Instead, she was about to face someone much stronger, a daughter seeking justice, a mother protecting her child, and a nurse who knew exactly how to gather evidence. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The vintage camera collection sat untouched in my father's study, each piece meticulously arranged on custom-built shelves. Eleanor hovered nearby, her designer heels clicking on the hardwood floors as she watched my every move. She'd insisted on being present for what she called my sentimental journey, claiming she wanted to support me through this difficult transition. Dr. Diana Foster's text from the hospital lab burned in my mind, preliminary DNA results showing irregularities that needed further investigation. But I kept my face carefully neutral as I ran my fingers over the old cameras, remembering how Dad would tell stories about each one. "These really should be appraised," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We wouldn't want such valuable pieces to go unprotected. I know an excellent auction house." I lifted an old Leica M3, Dad's favorite. "This one has so many memories. Remember when he took it to Vancouver for that last conference?" I watched Eleanor's reflection in the study's window, catching the slight tightening of her perfectly composed features. "Oh, darling, you must be confused. Your father never made it to Vancouver. The poor man was here, finalizing everything with me. The stress of it all probably affected your memory. You were quite pregnant then." I turned the camera over in my hands, remembering Dad's cryptic instructions during our last video call. "Always check the film compartment twice, Rachel. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in plain sight." At the time, I'd thought he was just being his usual meticulous self. "Actually," I said, carefully opening the back of the camera, "I have the video calls saved. Would you like to see them?" Eleanor's composure slipped for just a moment. "Video calls? Don't be ridiculous. Robert was here. I have witnesses. This grief must be affecting you more than we thought. Perhaps we should discuss extending your medical leave. For your own good, of course." My fingers found what I was looking for, a small SD card hidden in the camera's film compartment, cleverly disguised as part of the mechanism. I kept my face neutral as I closed the camera again. "You're probably right. Everything's been so confusing since the birth. Speaking of which, I should get back to the hospital for Emma's feeding. I could bring her here, you know," Eleanor said, following me toward the door. "This house has plenty of room, and with your medical issues, it would make sense to have her somewhere more stable." The threat was clear, but I forced myself to smile. "That's so thoughtful. Let me discuss it with Marcus." My husband's absence today hadn't surprised me. Eleanor claimed he was in critical meetings, but Dr. Foster's preliminary DNA report suggested other reasons he might be avoiding me. Back in my hospital room, James Harrison was waiting with Olivia and Dr. Wright. Their faces told me they'd found something significant. I pulled out the SD card. "Before you tell me what you found, look what was hidden in Dad's camera." James connected the card to his laptop, and suddenly my father's face filled the screen. The timestamp showed 3 days before his death. He looked tired, but determined. "Rachel, if you're watching this, then my suspicions about Eleanor Mitchell were correct. I'm recording this from Vancouver, though she'll try to prove I never left Seattle. The conference badge on the desk behind me shows today's date, and I've had this time-stamped by a notary here. He held up a newspaper, another proof of his location. I've discovered something about the Mitchells' company. Their finances are built on fraud. Eleanor's been embezzling from medical charities, using her brother's hospital connections to create fake research projects. But that's not the worst of it. He leaned closer to the camera. Yesterday, I received blood test results that suggest Marcus Mitchell may not be Emma's biological father. Eleanor knows this. She's had access to the hospital's records through her brother. She's been planning something, using this information. The documentation is hidden in... The video cut off abruptly. James looked up from the laptop. This is exactly what we needed, combined with what Dr. Wright found in the toxicology reports and Dr. Foster's DNA results. The DNA results are conclusive, Dr. Wright interrupted. Not only is Marcus not Emma's father, but the paternity matches a Dr. Andrew Parker, a physician who worked under Dr. Sterling at the hospital. He mysteriously transferred to a different state just before your due date. My mind raced back to a hospital fundraiser during my early pregnancy. Marcus had been out of town, and Dr. Parker had been unusually attentive. The next day, I'd felt strangely dizzy and had gaps in my memory. At the time, I'd blamed pregnancy symptoms. There's more, Olivia added. I spoke with a nurse who was on duty the night your father was admitted. She remembers Dr. Sterling giving him an injection, something that wasn't logged in the official records. She wrote it down in her personal notes because it seemed irregular. James spread out a stack of documents on my hospital bed. We found evidence of extensive financial fraud, medical malpractice, and what appears to be a long-term scheme involving targeted inheritance theft. Eleanor's done this before, to at least 3 other families. She uses her brother's hospital access to gather medical information, then manipulates situations to gain control of assets. And Marcus? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Based on the financial records we've uncovered, he's been fully aware of his mother's schemes. In fact, he's been instrumental in several of them. The DNA situation with Emma, that appears to have been orchestrated as leverage to ensure your cooperation in signing over the inheritance. I thought about Eleanor's earlier threat regarding Emma's custody. Everything was falling into place, the careful manipulation, the long game she'd played. She'd probably planned this even before Marcus and I were married. What do we do now? I asked, looking at each of them in turn. Now, James said, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. We spring the trap. Eleanor thinks she's got you cornered, ready to sign over everything tomorrow. Instead, she's going to walk into a meeting with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, the State Medical Board, and enough evidence to unravel everything she's built. I looked down at Emma, peacefully sleeping in her hospital bassinet. Eleanor had tried to use my daughter as a pawn in her scheme, never realizing she was actually giving me the strength to fight back. Tomorrow, she would learn exactly what happened when you underestimated a mother's determination to protect her child. One more thing, Dr. Wright added. We've located Dr. Parker. He's willing to testify about his involvement in Eleanor's schemes. Apparently, he's been looking for a way out for months. I nodded, feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Eleanor thought she'd orchestrated the perfect plan, using my medical vulnerability and Emma's paternity as weapons against me. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd threatened the 2 things I valued most: my father's legacy and my daughter's future. Tomorrow, she would learn that some inheritances weren't measured in money, and that my father's strength and determination lived on in me. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose decades of manipulation and deceit. Eleanor Mitchell's carefully constructed empire was about to crumble, and I would be there to watch it fall. The morning of the meeting dawned crisp and clear, Seattle's typical gray skies replaced by an unusually bright sun. I'd been discharged from the hospital the previous evening, against Eleanor's vociferous protests to my doctors. Now, dressed in my father's favorite power suit that I'd had carefully altered during my pregnancy, I sat in James Harrison's office, watching the security feed as Eleanor Mitchell arrived for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. She swept into the building's lobby exactly on schedule, her silver hair immaculate, designer handbag matching her expensive shoes perfectly. Marcus trailed behind her, his usually confident demeanor somewhat diminished. Through the high-quality feed, I could see the slight tremor in his hands, the same nervous tell I'd noticed throughout our marriage whenever he was hiding something. "Dr. Parker is in position," Olivia texted me. She had coordinated with the FBI to ensure every piece of evidence would be presented at exactly the right moment. "Dr. Sterling just arrived too. He's demanding to know why he was summoned." I watched Eleanor approach the receptionist, noting how she didn't even attempt to hide her smug smile. She expected to find me broken, ready to sign away my inheritance, to avoid a messy custody battle over Emma. Instead, she was walking into a carefully orchestrated exposure of her decades-long criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Mitchell," James's assistant greeted her with practiced professionalism, "please proceed to the main conference room on the 10th floor. Everyone is waiting." Eleanor's perfectly penciled eyebrows raised slightly at everyone, but she maintained her composure as she stepped into the elevator, Marcus following like a well-trained shadow. I couldn't help but notice how he kept checking his phone, likely hoping for some message from his various mistresses. Our investigation had uncovered at least 3, all strategically chosen from families with potential assets his mother could target. "Rachel," James touched my shoulder gently. "It's time. Are you ready?" I stood, smoothing down my suit jacket. I've been ready since I found that SD card in Dad's camera. I touched the flash drive now hanging around my neck, containing copies of all the evidence we'd gathered. "Is Emma secure?" "Dr. Wright has her in the hospital's highest security ward, with 2 FBI agents posted. She's perfectly safe." James understood my concern. Eleanor had proven she would use any leverage available. We took a private elevator to the conference room, entering through a side door that allowed me to observe the scene unfolding before making my presence known. The room was large, dominated by a massive mahogany table. Eleanor sat at one end, her perfect posture radiating confidence. Marcus slumped beside her, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Dr. Victor Sterling occupied a chair near his sister, his usual arrogant expression faltering as he noticed the serious faces of the other attendees, representatives from the FBI, the State Medical Board, and the Financial Crimes Unit. Dr. Parker sat opposite them, looking both terrified and relieved. "Shall we begin?" James stepped forward, his voice commanding immediate attention. "We're here to discuss the transfer of Robert Anderson's estate." Eleanor's red-painted lips curved into a victorious smile. "Yes, let's get this settled quickly. I have other appointments today." "Of course," James replied smoothly. "But first, I believe we should review some recently discovered documentation." He nodded to his assistant, who began distributing thick folders to everyone present. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly as she opened her folder. I watched her face carefully as she scanned the first page, a detailed timeline of her previous inheritance schemes, complete with bank transfers and falsified medical records. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "These documents are irrelevant. We're here to finalize the transfer." "Actually, Mother," I said, finally stepping into the room, "we're here to discuss several transfers, including the irregular movement of funds from medical charities, the suspicious deaths of previous victims, and the elaborate scheme you orchestrated involving my pregnancy." The color drained from Eleanor's perfectly made-up face. Marcus started to stand, but an FBI agent's hand on his shoulder kept him seated. "Rachel," Eleanor recovered quickly, her voice dripping with concern. "You're clearly still suffering from postpartum confusion. These wild accusations. Are fully documented, I interrupted, including Dad's video testimony from Vancouver. I turned to Dr. Sterling, who had begun to sweat visibly. Would you like to explain the unlogged injection you gave my father that night, Victor? Or should we ask the nurse who witnessed it? That was a routine antibiotic, Dr. Sterling stammered. Interesting, Dr. Wright spoke up from where he'd been quietly observing. Because our toxicology report shows something quite different. Something that, when combined with the medication you prescribed earlier that day, would cause exactly the symptoms that led to Robert Anderson's death. Eleanor's composure cracked further. This is absurd. Marcus, tell them. But Marcus wasn't. Looking at his mother. His eyes were fixed on Dr. Parker, who had begun describing in detail how Eleanor had coordinated the medical charity fraud, using her brother's hospital access to create fake research projects and siphon funds into offshore accounts. And the paternity deception? Parker continued, his voice shaking but determined. That was all orchestrated by Mrs. Mitchell. She had access to the fertility clinic records through Dr. Sterling. She knew exactly when to arrange. She drugged Rachel at that fundraiser. It was all planned. I stepped closer to Eleanor, whose perfectly manicured hands had begun to tremble. Did you really think I wouldn't fight back? That I would just hand over everything my father built? To protect myself from a custody battle over Emma? You had no right, Eleanor hissed, her mask finally cracking completely. We are old money. The Mitchells have been in Seattle society for generations. Your father was nothing but a self-made upstart who got lucky. That company, that fortune, it should have been ours. Mrs. Mitchell, the FBI agent in charge, stepped forward. I believe we've heard enough. Eleanor Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, medical malpractice coordination, and suspected involvement in multiple suspicious deaths. As the agents moved to handcuff Eleanor, she made one last desperate attempt. Marcus, do something. But Marcus remained frozen in his chair, reality finally crashing down around him. He looked up at me, his face pale. Rachel, I didn't know. About your father, about Dr. Parker. Mother said it was just about the inheritance. Save it for your lawyer, I said coldly. You'll need a good one. The evidence of your involvement in the previous schemes is quite extensive. As Eleanor was led away, still protesting her innocence and threatening lawsuits, Dr. Sterling was taken into custody as well. Dr. Parker would face charges too, but his cooperation had earned him some leniency. One by one, the pieces of Eleanor Mitchell's elaborate criminal enterprise were being dismantled. I remained standing in the conference room long after everyone else had left, looking out over the Seattle skyline my father had loved so much. James approached quietly, holding a fresh stack of documents. The court orders just came through, he said. Your father's estate is officially secure and we've frozen all the Mitchell family assets pending investigation. There will be more battles ahead, but for now, I finished. I need to go hold my daughter. I turned to him with a slight smile. Did you know Dad always told me that the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies? It's about building something stronger from what they tried to destroy. James, I nodded, understanding in his eyes. He would be proud of you, Rachel, not just for exposing Eleanor, but for how you're going to use his legacy. I touched the flash drive around my neck one last time before heading out. Eleanor had tried to steal my inheritance, thinking it was just about money and property. She never understood that the most valuable thing my father left me was his determination to fight for what was right. Whispers filled the courthouse corridor as I navigated through the crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. My father's company badge still hung around my neck. I'd just come from an emergency board meeting where I'd officially taken my place as CEO. The transition hadn't been easy, but Dad had prepared me better than I'd realized through years of dinner table discussions and weekend visits to the office. Olivia walked beside me, carrying a thick folder of hospital records. Behind us, Dr. Wright consulted quietly with the district attorney, explaining the complexities of the toxicology reports they'd uncovered. The preliminary hearing for Eleanor's case was about to begin, and the evidence kept mounting. Mrs. Anderson? A young intern from the forensic accounting team hurried up, clutching a tablet. We've found something in the offshore accounts. There are connections to 3 other suspicious deaths, all wealthy business owners who died shortly after meeting. The Mitchells. I took the tablet, scanning the familiar pattern of transactions. Each case followed Eleanor's signature method: gain trust, orchestrate medical emergencies, secure assets through carefully forged documents. The scope of her crimes was still expanding, each day bringing new revelations. The hospital board is meeting right now, Dr. Wright added, joining our conversation. They're reviewing every case Dr. Sterling handled in the past decade. The numbers. It's staggering how many patients might have been affected by their schemes. Before I could respond, a commotion erupted at the end of the hallway. Eleanor was being led in by court officers, her designer outfit replaced by standard-issue clothing that somehow still managed to look elegant on her. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something I'd never expected: fear. "Rachel," she called out, her voice carrying across the crowded space. "We need to talk. There are things you don't understand, things your father never told you about our history." The officers started to move her along, but I held up my hand. "I'm curious, Eleanor. What could possibly justify murdering multiple people for their money?" She drew herself up, attempting to regain her usual aristocratic bearing. "You think this is just about money? Your father and we had an arrangement years ago, before he met your mother. The company should have been a joint venture. He betrayed me, took everything we'd planned together and built it without me." A new voice cut through the tension. "That's not quite accurate, Eleanor." James Harrison approached, carrying a weathered leather portfolio. "I've had this in my personal files for 20 years. Robert asked me to keep it safe, said someday it might be needed." He opened the portfolio, revealing yellowed documents. "You see, Robert documented everything about your early arrangement, including how you attempted to embezzle from your first investors, how you suggested using hospital records to blackmail potential clients. He didn't betray you. He walked away because he refused to build a business on criminal activity." Eleanor's composed facade cracked slightly. "He had no right to judge me. The Mitchells have always done whatever necessary to maintain our position. We built this city's medical community through any means necessary." "Through fraud and murder, you mean?" I corrected. "How many people died because of your necessary means, Eleanor? How many families did you destroy?" "I protected my family's legacy," she hissed. "Everything I did was to ensure the Mitchell name remained powerful. Marcus understood that. He was raised to understand the importance of our position." "Speaking of Marcus," Dr. Wright interjected, "he's agreed to testify about everything. His statement to the FBI this morning was quite detailed." For the first time, I saw Eleanor's confidence truly shatter. "He wouldn't dare. I am his mother. And I was his wife," I reminded her. "That didn't stop you from orchestrating my assault at that fundraiser, using Dr. Parker to ensure my pregnancy would give you leverage. Family means nothing to you except as a tool for manipulation." The courthouse doors opened and more familiar faces entered. Dr. Parker, escorted by his own lawyers, looking both nervous and determined. Behind him, 3 women I recognized from the forensic accountant's report. Widows of Eleanor's previous victims, here to witness justice finally being served. "Mrs. Mitchell," the district attorney approached, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. "We're ready to discuss your plea options. Though, given the mounting evidence, I should warn you that our original offer may no longer be on the table." Eleanor's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is ridiculous. I am Eleanor Mitchell. My family built the medical infrastructure of this city. You can't possibly think these charges will stick. Actually, James said, producing another document, we've found records of exactly how your family built that infrastructure. Your grandfather's methods were remarkably similar to yours, exploiting medical emergencies for financial gain. The only difference is you modernized the approach. The district attorney checked her watch. It's time. Judge Harrison doesn't like to be kept waiting. She paused, glancing at Eleanor's designer-turned-prison attire. Interesting fact about Judge Harrison, she was college roommates with one of your previous victims. Small world, isn't it? As Eleanor was led toward the courtroom, she turned one last time. Rachel, think about Emma. She deserves to know her grandmother. We're still family. No, I said firmly, we're not. And Emma deserves to know that her mother stood up against corruption and cruelty, no matter how elegantly it was disguised. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind Eleanor, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Olivia squeezed my hand, supportively. Ready for this? I nodded, straightening my father's company pin on my lapel. Dad always said that true justice isn't about revenge. It's about bringing truth to light and preventing future harm. Today, we're doing both. Dr. Wright approached with a final update. The hospital board's preliminary review is complete. They've identified 27 suspicious deaths potentially linked to Dr. Sterling's treatments. The medical board is already moving to revoke his license permanently. And the research funds? I asked, thinking of all the genuine medical advancements that had been delayed or derailed by Eleanor's schemes. Being traced and recovered, James confirmed. Your father's plan to fund the new pediatric wing can still happen, Rachel. In fact, given what we've uncovered about the need for better oversight in medical funding, it's more important than ever. The bailiff appeared, calling us into the courtroom. As I walked through the doors, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished wood panels. I saw my father's determination in my eyes, my mother's compassion in my smile, and my own newfound strength in my bearing. Eleanor had tried to steal my inheritance, but she'd never understood that the most valuable things my father left me couldn't be measured in dollars or property deeds. They were measured in integrity, in the courage to stand against injustice, and in the determination to build something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. As I took my seat in the courtroom, ready to testify about everything we'd uncovered, I knew this wasn't just about punishing Eleanor Mitchell. It was about honoring my father's true legacy, one of healing and hope, not harm and greed. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Andrew Parker took the witness stand. Through the large windows, late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face as he prepared to reveal the full extent of Eleanor Mitchell's manipulation. My hands gripped the wooden bench tightly as I waited for his testimony to begin. Dr. Parker, the district attorney began, please tell us exactly how Mrs. Mitchell approached you about her plan regarding Rachel Anderson. Parker cleared his throat, his eyes briefly meeting mine before focusing on the prosecutor. It started at a hospital fundraiser 3 years ago. Eleanor invited me to her private office at the Mitchell Foundation. She explained that she needed my help with what she called a delicate family matter. I watched Eleanor's face as Parker spoke. Her mask of aristocratic indifference remained firmly in place, but her hands betrayed her tension, constantly adjusting and readjusting her court-mandated tracking bracelet. She told me about Rachel's engagement to Marcus, Parker continued. She said she needed insurance, her word, not mine, to ensure the Anderson fortune would remain under Mitchell control. She had accessed my personnel file through her brother and knew about my financial difficulties after my divorce. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. And what specifically did she ask you to do? She knew through Dr. Sterling that Rachel was planning to start a family after the wedding. Eleanor. She had a very specific plan. The hospital fundraiser was just the beginning. She orchestrated everything: the timing, the drugged drink, even making sure Marcus was out of town that weekend. My stomach churned as Parker described the cold calculation behind what I'd experienced as a confused, traumatic night. Eleanor had planned every detail, using her hospital connections and social position to orchestrate what amounted to a medical assault. After it was done, Parker's voice cracked slightly, she kept me under her control through a combination of threats and promises. Said she had evidence that would destroy my medical career if I ever spoke up. Meanwhile, she arranged for regular payments to be deposited in an offshore account. The evidence of those payments now filled 3 thick binders on the prosecutor's table, each transaction meticulously documented by the forensic accounting team. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. Each page represented another layer of Eleanor's methodical destruction of lives and legacies. Dr. Parker, the prosecutor pulled up a document on the courtroom's display screen. Can you identify this email? Parker leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Yes. Eleanor sent this after Rachel's pregnancy was confirmed. She was celebrating. Said everything was proceeding according to plan. The email appeared on all the courtroom screens. Eleanor's words glowed with sinister intent. Phase 1 complete. Once paternity is established, Robert Anderson will have no choice but to protect his daughter's reputation. The company will be ours before the baby arrives. I felt Olivia's hand squeeze mine supportively as we read Eleanor's casual discussion of destroying my life for financial gain. Next to her, Dr. Wright shook his head in disgust, no doubt thinking of his own Hippocratic oath and how thoroughly Eleanor and her brother had perverted the medical profession's principles. And what happened next? The prosecutor prompted. Eleanor's plan hit a snag. Robert Anderson wasn't as easily manipulated as she'd expected. He started investigating the Mitchell Foundation's finances, asking questions about their medical research funding. That's when Eleanor decided he needed to be removed from the equation. The courtroom stirred at this direct reference to murder. Even Eleanor's expensive defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But Parker wasn't finished. She made me document various medical symptoms that Robert had supposedly reported to me. Dr. Sterling used these fake records to justify the emergency admission and subsequent treatment that led to his death. Objection! Eleanor's attorney stood. Dr. Parker is speculating about events he didn't directly witness. Overruled, Judge Harrison responded firmly. The witness is describing his role in creating fraudulent medical documentation. Please continue, Dr. Parker. Parker looked directly at Eleanor for the first time. I helped cover up a murder. I'll live with that guilt forever. But I can't stay silent anymore. There were others before Robert Anderson. Eleanor had a whole system in place, targeting wealthy individuals with complex medical histories that could be exploited. As Parker detailed other cases, I studied Eleanor's face. Her composed exterior was cracking, revealing glimpses of the ruthless calculator beneath. She had spent decades building her reputation as Seattle's premier philanthropist, using the Mitchell Foundation's medical charity work as cover for her crimes. One final question, Dr. Parker, the prosecutor said. Why did you decide to come forward now? Parker's eyes met mine again. Because Rachel deserves to know the truth. Because Robert Anderson died trying to protect his daughter from Eleanor's schemes. And because every day I stayed silent, I was helping Eleanor identify and target new victims through the hospital system. As Parker stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecutor called for a brief recess. Eleanor was led away by court officers, but not before giving me one last calculating look. Even now, facing overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she was probably still plotting, still scheming. James Harrison appeared at my side with fresh documents. Rachel, the forensic team just found something in Eleanor's private records. It appears Robert wasn't her first choice for targeting the Anderson fortune. I took the papers, scanning quickly. She originally planned to go after Mom's inheritance? James nodded grimly. Your mother's car accident 12 years ago. It might not have been an accident. Eleanor had already begun establishing connections at the hospital where your mother was treated. The implications hit me hard. Eleanor's web of manipulation extended further back than any of us had imagined. She hadn't just targeted my father's company. She'd been plotting to control the Anderson fortune for over a decade. There's something else, James added, pulling out a weathered envelope. This was in your father's personal safe at the company. He left instructions for it to be opened only if something happened to him under suspicious circumstances. Inside was a single photograph, taken at what appeared to be a medical conference 20 years ago. It showed my father standing with a group of doctors, including a much younger Dr. Sterling. But it was the handwritten note on the back that caught my attention. Victor confessed tonight. Eleanor's methods haven't changed since medical school. Keep watching. Protect Rachel. Even years ago, my father had suspected Eleanor's true nature. He'd been gathering evidence, preparing protections, all while maintaining a careful facade of business friendship with the Mitchells. His final video message, hidden in the vintage camera, was just the last piece of a long-term strategy to expose Eleanor's crimes. As the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, I touched the company badge still hanging around my neck. Eleanor had tried to steal my inheritance, thinking it was just about money and property. She never understood that my father's true legacy was in the principles he lived by, the integrity he maintained even while moving in circles where corruption was treated as business as usual. The afternoon sun had shifted, no longer casting shadows but filling the courtroom with clear, revealing light. It felt appropriate somehow. Eleanor Mitchell's carefully constructed shadows were finally being dispersed, revealing the full extent of her decades-long web of manipulation and murder. The judge's gavel echoed through the hushed courtroom as Marcus Mitchell was called to testify. My soon-to-be ex-husband looked markedly different from his usual polished self. His designer suit replaced by a simple dark blazer. His confident swagger diminished to an uncertain shuffle as he approached the witness stand. Mr. Mitchell, the district attorney began, please tell the court about your role in your mother's financial operations. Marcus glanced nervously at Eleanor, who sat rigid and stone-faced at the defense table. I handled many of the property transfers. When Mother identified a target, I would help establish shell companies for asset acquisition. And were you aware of the methods your mother used to acquire these assets? He shifted uncomfortably, loosening his collar. Initially, she told me it was all legitimate. Just smart business strategy, using medical information to identify investment opportunities. But after the Thompson case... Tell us about the Thompson case, Mr. Mitchell. I leaned forward slightly, remembering the news headlines from 3 years ago about the mysterious death of real estate mogul William Thompson. Eleanor had appeared prominently in the society pages during his funeral, playing the role of grieving family friend. Mother had identified Mr. Thompson as a potential target. His daughter was dating one of my college friends. I was instructed to get close to the family, gather information about his health conditions, his business holdings. The prosecutor pulled up a series of documents on the courtroom screens. Are these the reports you prepared for your mother? Marcus nodded, his face pale. Yes. Details about his heart condition, his medications, his daily routine. I didn't know then that she would use this information to orchestrate his death? The prosecutor finished firmly. Objection. Eleanor's attorney stood. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Please rephrase. The district attorney nodded. Mr. Mitchell, what happened after you provided this information to your mother? She arranged a meeting with Uncle Victor, Dr. Sterling. 2 weeks later, Mr. Thompson had a fatal heart attack. All his major assets were transferred to Mitchell-controlled entities just days before, through documents I had prepared. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. I watched Eleanor's face, seeing the slight tightening around her eyes, the only sign that her son's testimony was affecting her. And what about Rachel Anderson? What was your role in your mother's plan regarding her inheritance? Marcus finally looked at me, his expression a mix of shame and desperation. Mother had been watching the Anderson Company for years. When Rachel and I met at that charity gala, it wasn't coincidence. Mother had orchestrated the entire introduction. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it still felt like a physical blow. Every moment of what I'd thought was a genuine romance had been carefully planned by Eleanor. She chose Rachel specifically? Yes. Mother had files on several potential targets, but Rachel was ideal. Only child, substantial inheritance pending, strong family values that could be exploited. Mother said Rachel's trust would make everything easier. The prosecutor approached with another document. Is this the initial strategy outline you prepared? Marcus stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. Yes. It details the three-phase approach Mother designed. Phase 1 was the marriage, establishing family connections. Phase 2 involved creating leverage through Emma's paternity situation. Phase 3 was to be the transfer of all Anderson assets to Mitchell control, using either blackmail or medical emergency scenarios. I felt Olivia's hand grip mine as we listened to the cold calculation behind what I'd thought was a love story. Dr. Wright, sitting on my other side, made a quiet sound of disgust. And your father's role in all this? Father, Marcus. Paused, swallowing hard. Father killed himself when I was in college, after discovering some of Mother's earlier schemes. She told everyone it was business stress, but he left me a letter. I should have come forward then, but Mother convinced me it was necessary to protect the family legacy. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly at the mention of her late husband. Her perfectly manicured hands clenched the edge of the defense. Let's talk about Dr. Parker, the prosecutor continued. When did you become aware of your mother's plan regarding Rachel's pregnancy? Mother told me to schedule a business trip during the hospital fundraiser. She said it was important I not be present. I didn't know the full details until after, when she informed me that steps had been taken to ensure the baby wouldn't be mine. The clinical way he described the orchestrated assault made my stomach turn. I thought of Emma, safely hidden away from all of this ugliness, and silently thanked whatever twist of fate had given her Dr. Parker's genes instead of Mitchell blood. And Robert Anderson's death? Were you involved in planning that? Not directly. Mother kept the medical aspect separate, working only with Uncle Victor. But I helped create the false documentation showing he was in Seattle during the time he was actually in Vancouver. We used old security footage, edited timestamps. The prosecutor nodded to her assistant, who began distributing thick folders to the jury. These records show a pattern of similar document falsification across multiple cases. Mr. Mitchell, how many times did you help create false records for your mother's targets? Marcus stared at his hands. 17 different cases over 8 years. Each time Mother said it was for the greater good of the Mitchell legacy. Each time I convinced myself to believe her. And now? Why are you testifying against her today? He looked up, first at Eleanor, then at me. Because Rachel's father died trying to expose the truth. Because every night since then, I see his face in my dreams. Because Emma deserves better than to inherit this legacy of lies and manipulation. Eleanor's mask finally cracked completely. Ungrateful child, she spat, rising from her seat. Everything I did was for you, for our family name, Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Harrison warned sharply. Control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom. The outburst seemed to strengthen Marcus's resolve. He sat straighter, his voice firmer. Mother built our family's power on death and fraud. She taught me that the Mitchell name was everything, that any action was justified to maintain our position. But Rachel showed me there are more important things than social status and wealth. I felt a complex mix of emotions as I watched my husband, my betrayer, finally choose truth over family loyalty. The love I'd felt for him was gone, destroyed by his willing participation in Eleanor's schemes. But there was a kind of closure in watching him finally break free from his mother's toxic influence. The prosecutor had one final question. Mr. Mitchell, do you understand that your testimony today may result in criminal charges against you? As well? Yes, he replied quietly. I deserve whatever punishment the court decides, but Emma deserves to know that at least one of her parents finally chose to tell the truth. As Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, I caught a glimpse of something I'd never seen before in Eleanor's eyes: fear. Not of prison or punishment, but of something far worse in her mind: the complete destruction of the Mitchell legacy she'd spent decades building through manipulation and murder. The medical board hearing room buzzed with tension as Dr. Victor Sterling entered, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Unlike his sister Eleanor, who maintained her aristocratic bearing even in custody, Victor looked like a man crumbling under the weight of his crimes. Dr. Sterling, the board chairman began, we've reviewed the evidence provided by the district attorney's office. Would you care to explain how you justified using your medical license to facilitate multiple homicides? The room fell silent. Gone was Sterling's characteristic arrogance, replaced by a desperate kind of resignation. You have to understand the pressure Eleanor created, the Mitchell name, the family legacy. It was everything to her. I sat between Dr. Wright and James Harrison, watching the man who had helped murder my father try to rationalize his actions. Behind us, families of other victims filled the rows of seats, each carrying their own stories of lives destroyed by the Sterling Mitchell conspiracy. Pressure doesn't explain falsifying medical records to cause intentional patient deaths, the chairman pressed. Your sister's social ambitions hardly justify serial murder. Sterling's hands shook as he reached for the water glass before him. It started small. Eleanor would identify wealthy patients, ask me to adjust their records slightly, create opportunities for the Mitchell Foundation to step in, offer assistance. The deaths, those came later. The board's medical ethics expert leaned forward. Tell us about Robert Anderson. How did you justify poisoning a healthy man who was trying to protect his daughter? Robert was becoming dangerous, Sterling replied, his professional demeanor cracking. He'd discovered irregularities in our research funding, was asking questions about previous cases. Eleanor said he needed to be handled before he ruined everything. I felt Dr. Wright tense beside me as Sterling described the calculated way they'd planned my father's murder. The familiar anger rose in my chest, but now it was tempered with something else: determination to ensure this never happened to another family. And the fertility clinic records? Another board member asked. You abused your position to access private medical information, which your sister then used for blackmail and manipulation. Sterling glanced at me briefly before looking away. Eleanor had a comprehensive plan for the Anderson inheritance. Everything had to be controlled, including Rachel's pregnancy, the timing, the circumstances. You mean the orchestrated assault? The chairman interrupted sharply. Let's be clear about what you facilitated, Dr. Sterling. The room stirred as more documents were distributed, detailed records of how Sterling had helped Eleanor access and manipulate medical information across multiple hospitals and clinics. Each page revealed another layer of calculated cruelty. Your cooperation with the investigation is noted, the chairman continued, but it doesn't excuse decades of ethical violations and criminal behavior. This board has no choice but to permanently revoke your medical license, effective immediately. Furthermore, we're recommending a complete audit of every case you've handled in the past 20 years. Sterling seemed to age years in moments. You don't understand what Eleanor will do when she finds out I've lost my license. the family position, our status in the medical community. I think we understand perfectly, Dr. Wright spoke up, his voice carrying clear authority. You're more afraid of your sister's disapproval than facing justice for multiple murders. That speaks volumes about the Mitchell family values. The chairman nodded grimly. Dr. Wright has been appointed to head the review committee for all cases potentially compromised by your actions. Every patient record, every prescription, every medical decision will be scrutinized. I watched as the reality of his situation finally seemed to hit Sterling. His role as Eleanor's medical accomplice had cost him not just his license, but his entire identity in the medical community. "Rachel," he said suddenly, turning to face me. "You should know. Your father tried to warn others. He approached me privately, offered to help me come clean about Eleanor's schemes. I could have stopped it all then, saved his life and many others, but I chose the Mitchell name over my oath as a doctor." James Harrison produced a file. "We found this in Robert's private records, a detailed account of his meeting with you, including recordings. He gave you a chance to do the right thing." Sterling's shoulders slumped. "Yes, he was a better man than any of us." Eleanor saw that as weakness, but it was real strength, the kind our family pretended to have but never understood. The board chairman called for a brief recess before announcing additional sanctions. As Sterling was led out, I overheard him muttering something that chilled me. "Eleanor always has a backup plan. Always." James caught my concerned look. "Don't worry. We've got extra security on Emma, and every Mitchell family account is frozen. Whatever backup plan Eleanor might have had, we've cut off her resources." Dr. Wright touched my arm gently. "Rachel, there's something else you should know. We've been reviewing your father's research proposals from before his death, the pediatric wing he wanted to fund. It wasn't just about expanding the hospital. He'd designed a new system for protecting patient records, preventing exactly the kind of access abuse Sterling and Eleanor exploited." The revelation brought fresh tears to my eyes. Even in his final days, Dad had been working to protect others from the Mitchell's schemes. "The board has fast-tracked approval for implementing his security protocols," Dr. Wright continued. "Every hospital in our network will have them within months. Robert Anderson's legacy will be saving countless future patients from similar manipulation." As we left the hearing room, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I was wearing my father's old lab coat, the one he'd kept from his early days developing medical technology. Beneath it, a flash drive hung around my neck, containing not just evidence of Eleanor's crimes, but also Dad's complete plans for protecting patient privacy. Sterling's words about Eleanor's backup plans nagged at me, but I felt stronger than ever. The Mitchells had built their empire on manipulation and murder, using medical information as a weapon. But they'd never understood that real power comes from using knowledge to help others, not harm them. My phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. Emma had woken from her nap, bright and happy in the secure hospital nursery. I smiled, thinking how different her future would be from the one Eleanor had planned. She would grow up knowing that her grandfather's true legacy wasn't just about wealth or social status, but about protecting the vulnerable and standing up against corruption. The afternoon sun caught the edge of Dad's lab coat, making the embroidered Anderson name glow. Eleanor had tried to steal our inheritance, but she'd never understood that the most valuable things my father left behind weren't in any bank account or property deed. They were in the principles he lived by, the innovations he created to help others, and the courage he showed in standing up to powerful people who abused their positions. That was the real inheritance I would pass on to Emma, not the Mitchell legacy of manipulation and murder, but the Anderson tradition of using knowledge and resources to protect and heal. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of my father's office, now my office, as I reviewed the latest findings from the forensic accounting team. Eleanor's web of financial manipulation stretched further than anyone had initially suspected, touching medical facilities across 3 states. Each new discovery brought more families forward, more stories of lives destroyed by the Mitchell family's ruthless ambition. Olivia entered with fresh coffee and another stack of documents. The FBI just sent these over. They've identified 15 more suspicious deaths connected to Eleanor's foundation donations. All wealthy donors who mysteriously changed their wills just before dying under Dr. Sterling's care. I pushed back from the antique desk my father had loved so much, walking to the wall of windows overlooking Seattle's medical district. From here, I could see the hospital where Sterling had conducted his deadly work, where Eleanor had orchestrated her elaborate schemes. The building that had once filled me with pride as a nurse now held darker memories. "Ms. Anderson?" My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Foster is here with the final DNA analysis results." I took a deep breath, straightening my jacket. "Send her in." Dr. Diana Foster entered, carrying a thick manila envelope. Her face held the serious expression I'd come to recognize from her testimony at Eleanor's trial. "Rachel, you'll want to sit down for this." The DNA results weren't just about Emma's paternity anymore. We'd discovered that Eleanor's manipulation of medical records went far deeper, affecting multiple families over decades. Dr. Foster spread the documents across my desk, pointing to highlighted sections. "It's worse than we thought." Eleanor didn't just arrange Emma's paternity situation. She had a long-standing arrangement with several fertility clinics. She was literally engineering family connections to facilitate her inheritance schemes. My hands trembled as I read through the analysis. Names jumped out at me. Prominent families whose lives Eleanor had methodically infiltrated through carefully orchestrated pregnancies and falsified medical records. The Thompson case wasn't unique, Dr. Foster continued. She used the same method at least 7 times. Create artificial family connections, then use those relationships to gain access to assets. The medical records were altered so perfectly that no one ever questioned the biological relationships. A knock at the door interrupted us. James Harrison entered, his face grave. "Rachel, we've found something in the Mitchell Foundation's archived records." Eleanor wasn't working alone in the fertility clinic scheme. She had help from someone with high-level access to multiple medical facilities. "Another doctor?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "No," James replied, laying out more documents. "Someone with administrative access. Someone who could move through different hospitals without raising suspicion." Olivia gasped softly as she read the name. Catherine Sterling, Victor's wife. She was the head administrator for the hospital network's records department. The pieces clicked into place. Catherine's position had given Eleanor perfect cover for accessing and altering medical records across multiple facilities. Her signature appeared on countless documents we'd discovered, authorizing file transfers and record modifications. "She's agreed to testify," James added. Apparently, Eleanor's arrest was the final push she needed. Catherine's been keeping her own records of everything, insurance against the day Eleanor might turn on her. Dr. Foster gathered her papers quickly. "This changes everything. With Catherine's testimony and these DNA analyses, we can prove systematic fraud across the entire hospital network. Every inheritance transfer Eleanor orchestrated could be invalidated." My phone buzzed with an urgent message from Dr. Wright. Internal Affairs had just finished their review of Dr. Sterling's cases. The number of suspicious deaths had doubled. Each victim showed the same pattern: wealthy, recently in contact with the Mitchell Foundation, dead under questionable circumstances in Sterling's care. "There's something else," Olivia said quietly, pulling up an email on her tablet. "The nurses at Seattle General have been talking. Apparently, Eleanor had a special arrangement with certain staff members. They were paid to report any wealthy patients showing signs of serious illness. The systematic nature of Eleanor's operation stunned me. She hadn't just targeted a few wealthy families. She'd turned an entire medical network into her personal hunting ground. "What about the research funding?" I asked, thinking of all the legitimate medical projects that had been derailed by Eleanor's schemes. James pulled out another file. "We've traced most of it. Eleanor diverted millions from actual research into shadow accounts. The money was used to bribe officials, silence potential witnesses, and fund her social philanthropy that gave her access to potential targets." A soft knock drew our attention. Dr. Parker stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." He handed me a worn leather journal. "I found this in Catherine Sterling's office. It's Eleanor's personal diary from medical school." The journal revealed the origins of Eleanor's schemes. Even as a young medical student, she'd been plotting ways to use patient information for personal gain. The early entries showed a calculated understanding of how medical vulnerabilities could be exploited. "The last entry," Dr. Parker said softly, "is about your father." Eleanor had identified him as a target years ago when he first started developing medical technology. She saw his potential success and started planning even then. I ran my fingers over my father's name in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Even before I was born, she had marked my family for destruction. The Mitchell legacy she'd been so proud of was built on decades of calculated murder and manipulation. James checked his watch. "The FBI task force is meeting in an hour. They want to coordinate the multi-state investigation. With Catherine Sterling's evidence and these new DNA findings, we're looking at one of the largest medical fraud cases in history." I nodded, gathering the documents. The magnitude of Eleanor's crimes was still expanding, touching more lives, revealing more victims. But with each new discovery, we were also finding ways to help those affected, to restore what the Mitchells had stolen. Looking out over the medical district again, I saw not just the buildings where Eleanor had orchestrated her crimes, but also the future my father had envisioned, one where medical knowledge was used to heal, not harm. The inheritance she had tried to steal wasn't just about money or property. It was about the responsibility to protect and serve others, to use medical science for its true purpose. Emma's soft coo came through the baby monitor on my desk, reminding me that amid all this darkness, new life and hope continued. She would grow up knowing the truth about both sides of her heritage, the Mitchell legacy of deception, and the Anderson commitment to healing and justice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office floor, but they no longer felt threatening. Eleanor's shadows were finally being dispersed, replaced by the clear light of truth and accountability. The sentencing day arrived with an unusual clarity in Seattle's typically overcast sky. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and families of Eleanor's victims, all waiting to witness the final chapter of a scandal that had shaken the medical community to its core. I adjusted my father's old watch on my wrist, a quiet reminder of why we were all here. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor Mitchell sat perfectly, poised in her designer suit, somehow managing to look elegant despite her current circumstances. Her silver hair was immaculately styled, her makeup flawless, presenting the same carefully crafted image of aristocratic dignity she'd maintained throughout her reign of manipulation and murder. Dr. Foster slipped into the seat beside me, clutching a thick folder of final DNA analysis reports. The last results came in this morning. 23 manipulated fertility cases confirmed. She didn't just steal inheritances, she engineered entire family lines to facilitate her schemes. Catherine Sterling was led in next, her hospital administrator's confidence replaced by nervous tension. Her testimony had blown the case wide open, revealing the intricate system Eleanor had developed for tracking and targeting wealthy patients across multiple medical facilities. Judge Harrison entered, her face grave as she took her place at the bench. The room fell silent, years of pain and anticipation hanging heavy in the air. "Before we proceed with sentencing, Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any final statement for the court?" Eleanor rose gracefully, every movement calculated for maximum effect. Your Honor, everything I did was to protect and preserve a legacy of medical excellence. The Mitchell name has been synonymous with healthcare in this city for generations. My methods may seem harsh to outsiders, but in the world of medical advancement, difficult decisions must sometimes be made. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Even now, facing irrefutable evidence of her crimes, Eleanor was attempting to justify murder and manipulation as necessary sacrifices for her family's status. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Harrison's voice cut through the whispers. You orchestrated multiple murders through medical manipulation. You corrupted healthcare professionals, exploited patient information, and destroyed families, all to satisfy your own greed and social ambition. Your actions represent the most egregious abuse of medical trust this court has ever seen. Eleanor's perfect composure cracked slightly. I built an empire of medical innovation. The Mitchell Foundation has funded breakthrough research, supported countless medical initiatives. Research funded by stolen money, the judge interrupted. Initiatives used as cover for identifying and exploiting vulnerable patients. You didn't build an empire of medical innovation, Mrs. Mitchell. You built a systematic criminal enterprise that perverted every principle of medical ethics. The judge lifted a document from her bench. The impact statements submitted to this court tell the real story of your legacy. Families destroyed, lives ended prematurely, medical records manipulated to serve your financial schemes. You didn't preserve medical excellence, you corrupted it for personal gain. I watched Eleanor's face as Judge Harrison read through the list of charges. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, medical fraud, inheritance fraud, identity theft, and dozens of other crimes spanning decades. Each charge stripped away another layer of her carefully maintained facade. Furthermore, the judge continued, your manipulation of fertility clinic records and deliberate engineering of pregnancies without consent represents a particularly heinous violation of medical ethics and human dignity. Dr. Foster squeezed my hand as the judge referenced the fertility schemes. The final DNA analysis had revealed how Eleanor had systematically created artificial family connections to facilitate her inheritance fraud, using medical technology, as a weapon against the very families who trusted the Mitchell name. Taking into consideration the magnitude and duration of your crimes, as well as their devastating impact on countless families, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets of the Mitchell Foundation and related entities will be liquidated to create a victim compensation fund. Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. You can't erase generations of Mitchell influence. Our family built this city's medical infrastructure. Your family exploited and corrupted that infrastructure, Judge Harrison replied firmly. The true legacy of the Mitchell name will be as a warning to others who would abuse medical trust for personal gain. As Eleanor was led away by court officers, her perfectly maintained image crumbling at last, I thought about all the lives she had impacted. The families represented in the courtroom were just the ones we'd identified. How many other victims remained unknown, their medical histories manipulated, their deaths orchestrated for Eleanor's profit? James Harrison approached with final documents requiring my signature. The Anderson Medical Technology Initiative, renamed in my father's honor, would take over the legitimate research projects abandoned by the Mitchell Foundation. More importantly, it would implement the security protocols my father had designed to prevent future abuse of patient information. Your father would be proud, James said quietly. He tried to stop Eleanor's schemes, and now you've finished what he started. The new protocols will protect patients across the entire medical network. I touched the flash drive still hanging around my neck, containing both evidence of Eleanor's crimes and my father's plans for securing medical data. He understood that medical knowledge is a responsibility, not a weapon. That's the legacy I want to pass on to Emma. Dr. Wright joined us, his face showing both satisfaction and determination. The hospital board has approved a complete overhaul of all systems Eleanor and Sterling might have compromised. Every patient record, every research protocol, every security measure will be reviewed and updated. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around seeking statements about Eleanor's sentencing, but my attention was drawn to a group of people. Gathered quietly to one side, families of Eleanor's victims, holding photographs of their loved ones. They weren't here for vengeance or sensational headlines. They were here to witness justice, to see the system their family members had trusted finally hold accountable those who had abused that trust. A soft autumn breeze carried the scent of rain as I walked down the courthouse steps. Eleanor's perfectly organized world of manipulation and murder had finally crumbled, but the work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. The Mitchell name would indeed be remembered, not as a symbol of medical excellence, but as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of greed and ambition in healthcare. The true inheritance, the legacy worth preserving, wasn't in bank accounts or social status. It was in the commitment to using medical knowledge to protect and heal, in the determination to stand against those who would exploit vulnerable patients, and in the courage to expose corruption no matter how powerful its perpetrators might be. Emma would grow up knowing this truth, understanding that her grandfather died protecting these principles, and that her mother fought to ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The Mitchell empire of manipulation had fallen, but from its ruins, something far more valuable would rise. A renewed commitment to medical ethics and patient protection that would truly serve the community Eleanor had claimed to care about. Spring sunlight streamed through the windows of the newly established Anderson Center for Medical Ethics, illuminating the dedication plaque that bore my father's name. 1 year had passed since Eleanor Mitchell's sentencing, and the medical community was still grappling with the aftermath of her decades-long reign of manipulation. Today marked the opening of the center, built in the space once occupied by the Mitchell Foundation's offices. The transformation was more than symbolic. Where Eleanor had once plotted to exploit patient vulnerabilities, medical professionals would now train in ethical practices and patient protection protocols. Dr. Foster approached, carrying the latest report from the ongoing investigation. We've identified 3 more cases from the early 90s. Eleanor's schemes went back further than anyone imagined, but there's something else you should see. She handed me a worn, leather-bound journal. This was found in Catherine Sterling's old office. It's Eleanor's mother's diary. The journal revealed a chilling pattern of inherited corruption. Eleanor's mother had begun the practice of exploiting patient information for social gain, teaching her daughter that medical knowledge was a weapon to be wielded against the vulnerable. The Mitchell legacy of manipulation stretched back generations. Dr. Parker is ready for the first ethics seminar, Olivia announced, entering with Emma in her arms. My daughter, now walking and babbling, reached for me with a bright smile that held none of the Mitchell calculation. The medical students are particularly interested in his perspective on how seemingly minor ethical compromises can lead to systemic corruption. The seminar room filled quickly with medical professionals eager to learn from the Mitchell case. Dr. Parker stood at the podium, his face showing both remorse and determination as he prepared to share his experience of being drawn into Eleanor's web of manipulation. Understanding how Eleanor Mitchell corrupted the medical system isn't just about preventing large-scale fraud, he began. It's about recognizing the small compromises that make larger ethical violations possible. Each time we prioritize profit over patient welfare, each time we treat medical information as a commodity rather than a trust, we take a step down the path she followed. James Harrison slipped into the seat beside me, carrying fresh documents. The Victim Compensation Fund is fully operational. We've already processed claims from 57 families affected by Eleanor's schemes. But there's something else you should know. Marcus has agreed to testify against some of Eleanor's former business associates who helped hide the stolen assets. My ex-husband's cooperation had surprised many, but I understood his motivation. Like Dr. Parker, Marcus was trying to atone for his role in his mother's crimes. His testimony would help recover millions in stolen funds, money that would now support legitimate medical research and patient care. Dr. Wright joined our discussion, adding his perspective as the new head of hospital security. The Anderson protocols your father designed have already prevented 3 attempts at unauthorized access to patient records. Medical facilities across the country are adopting the system. Robert's vision of protected patient information is becoming reality. A soft murmur drew our attention to the entrance, where Catherine Sterling was being escorted in by security. Her testimony had been crucial in unraveling Eleanor's schemes, but this was her first time facing the medical community she had helped betray. "I spent decades justifying my actions," Catherine began, her voice trembling slightly, "telling myself that the Mitchell Foundation's charitable works outweighed the ethical compromises. Eleanor was skilled at making corruption seem necessary, even noble. She turned medical trust into a weapon, and I helped her aim it." The audience sat in rapt attention as Catherine detailed the systematic way Eleanor had identified and targeted vulnerable patients. Each example illustrated how the Mitchell family had corrupted legitimate medical practices for personal gain. The fertility clinic manipulations were perhaps the most insidious, Catherine continued. Eleanor didn't just steal inheritances. She literally engineered family connections to facilitate her schemes. She saw human genetics as just another system to be manipulated for profit. Dr. Foster stood to present the complete findings of her DNA investigation. The scope of Eleanor's genetic manipulation had shocked even those familiar with her other crimes. She had created a complex web of artificial family relationships, all designed to position Mitchell allies within wealthy families targeted for exploitation. "But there's hope in this revelation," Dr. Foster explained. "Understanding how Eleanor abused medical technology helps us design better protections. Each discovered case of manipulation strengthens our commitment to ethical practices." The afternoon sessions focused on implementing the new security protocols my father had designed. His final gift to the medical community wasn't just exposing Eleanor's crimes, it was creating systems to prevent similar abuses from happening again. Emma's laughter echoed through the halls as she played in the center's new daycare facility, a sound that reminded me of the future we were working to protect. She would grow up in a medical community transformed by the exposure of Eleanor's crimes, one committed to using its knowledge and power to heal rather than harm. The Anderson Center would stand as a testament to that commitment, training new generations of medical professionals to recognize and resist the kind of corruption Eleanor had championed. Where she had seen patient vulnerabilities as opportunities for exploitation, we would teach medical students to see them as sacred trusts, to be protected. James approached with a final piece of news. "The last of Eleanor's hidden accounts has been traced. The funds will be used to establish scholarships for ethics research. Your father's legacy of protecting patients will continue through education and innovation." The setting sun cast long shadows through the center's windows, but these shadows held no threat. They reminded me instead of how far we'd come from the dark days of Eleanor's manipulation. The Mitchell Empire had crumbled, but from its ruins, something far more valuable had emerged: a renewed commitment to medical ethics and patient protection. As I watched Emma play, unaware of the complex legacy that had shaped her existence, I thought about the true nature of inheritance. Eleanor had tried to steal my father's financial legacy, never understanding that his real gift to me was the moral courage to stand against corruption, no matter how elegantly it was disguised. That was the inheritance I would pass on to Emma, not the Mitchell tradition of exploitation, but the Anderson commitment to using medical knowledge as a force for healing and protection. The center bearing my father's name would ensure that this legacy continued, teaching future generations that true medical excellence lies not in social status or financial gain, but in the sacred trust between healer and patient. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Mitchell's sentencing, and the medical community had undergone a profound transformation. Standing in the expanded wing of the Anderson Center for Medical Ethics, I watched as Emma, now a curious kindergartner, pressed her small hands against the glass wall overlooking Seattle's medical district. "Mommy, is this where Grandpa helped?" "People?" she asked, her bright eyes reflecting the morning sunlight. The innocence in her question touched something deep in my heart. She would never meet the grandfather who had sacrificed everything to protect her future. But his spirit lived on in every corner of this place. Today marked the inauguration of the Robert Anderson Memorial Scholarship Program, designed to support medical students committed to ethical practice and patient advocacy. The ceremony would bring together families touched by Eleanor's crimes, now united in their dedication to preventing similar abuses of medical trust. Dr. Foster arrived early, carrying the final report of her comprehensive DNA study. "We've completed the last genetic analysis. 217 families were affected by Eleanor's fertility manipulation schemes. But here's the remarkable part. Many of these families have chosen to maintain their relationships, proving that true family bonds transcend genetic engineering." The morning news played quietly on a nearby screen, showing Eleanor Mitchell's latest appeal being denied. She had aged dramatically in prison, her once perfect appearance now marked by time and defeat. The Mitchell name, once synonymous with medical philanthropy, had become a case study in institutional corruption. The Anderson protocols have been implemented in over 500 hospitals nationwide, James Harrison announced, joining us with fresh statistics. Not a single case of systematic medical exploitation has succeeded since their introduction. Robert's vision of protected patient information has become the industry standard. Dr. Parker, now heading the center's ethics training program, led a group of medical students through the hall. His journey from reluctant participant in Eleanor's schemes to passionate advocate for medical ethics had inspired many young professionals to examine their own moral compass. The key is recognizing that medical knowledge is a responsibility, not a weapon, he was explaining to his students. Eleanor Mitchell saw patient vulnerabilities as opportunities for exploitation. We must see them as sacred trusts to be protected. Catherine Sterling's testimony had sparked a national review of hospital administration practices. Her detailed records of Eleanor's methods had led to the creation of new safeguards against administrative corruption. Today, she worked as a consultant, helping medical facilities identify and close security gaps that could be exploited by those seeking to abuse patient trust. Marcus, who had served a shorter sentence for his role in the schemes, had chosen to leave Seattle after his release. His last letter expressed a desire to work with medical charities, attempting to balance the scales his mother had so dramatically tipped toward corruption. Emma occasionally received cards from him on her birthday, each one carrying a simple message of hope for her future. The Anderson Medical Technology Initiative, built from the recovered Mitchell Foundation assets, had revolutionized patient data protection. Hospitals across the globe now used systems based on my father's original designs, ensuring that medical information served its true purpose: healing and protection, not exploitation and profit. Olivia, now the center's chief of operations, approached with Emma's favorite teddy bear wearing a tiny lab coat. "The families are starting to arrive for the ceremony. Dr. Wright says the new pediatric security wing is ready for the tour afterward." I watched as the auditorium filled with faces both familiar and new. Survivors of Eleanor's schemes sat alongside medical students eager to learn from the past. The Mitchell Empire had fallen, but its destruction had sparked a revolution in medical ethics and patient protection. "Rachel," Dr. Foster called softly, "we found something else in the old Mitchell Foundation records. It's a letter your father wrote to Emma, dated just days before his death. He must have known what Eleanor was planning." With trembling hands, I opened the sealed envelope. My father's familiar handwriting filled the page. "My dearest granddaughter, by the time you read this, the truth about the Mitchell family will be known. But their crimes are not your inheritance. Your legacy comes from those who chose to protect rather than exploit. to heal rather than harm. Remember that true strength lies not in power over others, but in the courage to stand for what's right. Emma tugged at my sleeve, pointing to her grandfather's photograph on the wall. He helped make hospitals safe, right, Mommy? Like you do now? I lifted her into my arms, feeling the weight of both tragedy and triumph in her innocent question. Yes, sweetheart. He taught us that medical knowledge is a gift to be used for helping others, not hurting them. That's the real inheritance. He left us. The understanding that true healing comes from compassion, not exploitation. The afternoon sun cast its warm light through the center's windows, illuminating the faces of those gathered to celebrate not just the end of Eleanor's dark legacy, but the beginning of a new era in medical ethics. The Mitchell name would fade into history as a cautionary tale, while the Anderson legacy would continue to grow through every patient protected, every student taught, every life touched by the principles my father died defending. As I prepared to address the gathered crowd, I touched the flash drive still hanging around my neck, no longer containing evidence of crimes, but serving as a reminder of the power of truth to overcome corruption. Eleanor had tried to steal my inheritance, never understanding that the most valuable legacy isn't measured in money or social status, but in the lives we choose to protect and the principles we choose to uphold. Emma would grow up in a medical community transformed by the exposure of Eleanor's crimes, one dedicated to using its knowledge and power for healing rather than harm. She would inherit not the Mitchell tradition of exploitation, but the Anderson commitment to protecting the vulnerable and standing against corruption. And in that inheritance lay the greatest victory of all, the triumph of compassion over greed, of healing over harm, of truth over manipulation. The story of Eleanor Mitchell's crimes would be told not as a saga of successful deception, but as a testament to the enduring power of medical ethics and human dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.